Hello, my name is Andrew Davis of Durham University. This talk consists of some philosophical reflections on the constructivism metaphor. It's been a hot topic in studies of teaching and learning for many decades. An opening scene, a primary classroom many decades ago. I am there. What is the capital of France, Smith? Madrid, sir. No, Smith, stand up. Paris is the capital city of France. What is the capital of France, Davis? I had a copy of The Hobbit on my knees. I was making furtive efforts to read it. I raised my head every so often to masquerade as an attentive pupil. Edinburgh, sir. Stand up, Davis. The book slid to the floor with a crash, observed grimly by the teacher. What is the capital of France, Fisher? Paris, sir. Thank you, Fisher. The teacher slowly approached my desk. I knew what would happen next. It would be difficult to discover living examples of this teaching style. Let's call it extreme transmission. When we think about learning, we tend to use sets of interconnected metaphors. One cluster of metaphors contrasts transmission and construction. An extreme transmission account might go as follows, but to repeat, I really doubt that anyone teaches like this in 2020. When I learn some history, I take in an item of knowledge. I learn that the Battle of Hastings occurred in 1066. So now there is a fact in my head that was not there previously. The teacher may have transmitted this fact to me. This thought, in turn, is associated with more familiar metaphors. The learner is an empty rucksack to be filled with knowledge. She may even be an empty vessel into which knowledge is to be poured. The maths educator Hilary Chouard once commented in a famous TV documentary that children had proved to be very leaky vessels. Over recent decades, educational thinking about learning has been strongly influenced by images opposed to transmission. These themes featured construction and invention. The idea has been that learners just cannot have knowledge inserted into their minds. Instead, they have to construct their knowledge. Many contemporary versions of constructivism emphasize the role of the social world. Constructivists, drawing on their Piagetian tradition, are often characterized as individualist, whereas social constructivists owe their inspiration to Vygotsky. The social approach denies that learners are left to their own devices when constructing knowledge. Vygotsky claims that learners have functions in an embryonic state. These will come to fruition if they work alongside learners and or adults with a greater mastery of the subject matter concerned. But constructivism has recently come under sustained attack from some educators, especially those who associate it with progressivism and child-centred education. In the UK, the Department for Education appears to sympathise with these attacks. Piaget is one of the intellectual ancestors of constructivism. Quote, "To understand is to discover or reconstruct by rediscovery. End of quote. And another quote from Piaget: each time one prematurely teaches a child something he could have discovered for himself, the child is kept from inventing it, and consequently from understanding it completely. And another quote: real comprehension of a notion or a theory implies the reinvention of this theory by the subject. Naturally, this does not mean that the teacher has no role anymore, but that his role is less that of a person who gives lessons and is rather that of someone who organizes situations that will give rise to curiosity and solution seeking in the child, and who will support such behavior by means of appropriate arrangements. How, asks Piaget, do children progress from one knowledge state to another? He invoked two ideas to capture what takes place: assimilation and accommodation. A child assimilating new knowledge fits it into existing ways of thinking, concepts or structures. So, for instance, a child knows about hammers. She encounters a wooden mallet and decides this is a hammer. The mallet is assimilated into her current way of thinking about hammers. Actually, it may not behave like other hammers, according to her, since she may discover that the nail goes into the mallet rather than into the wall. When accommodating, an individual must change existing ways of thinking, concepts or structures to cope with the fresh knowledge. Consider Parveen, who understands numbers to 100. She appreciates their function for basic counting and at least something of how they relate to each other. For instance, it is evident to her that if 5 is 2 more than 3, then 3 must be 2 less than 5. When we need more than one digit to represent a number, she grasps the function of each digit. Hence, 52 is seen as 5 tens and 2 more units, and so forth. She now follows a program of activities about fractions. She divides wholes into equal parts, the cake model of fractions. She splits sets or groups into equal subsets to find fractions of them. 12 is carved up into 2 equal parts to find half of it, and so on. She reaches a point where she learns that fractions themselves are numbers between the whole numbers. These can be represented as such on the number line. This transforms her previous conceptions of numbers. She can now use numbers to represent quantities in addition to counting with them. In short, Parveen's existing knowledge has accommodated the new knowledge about fractions. The Piagetian story, in effect, offers us a powerful interpretation of knowledge being acquired with at least some degree of understanding. In the picture of the child's mind as an empty rucksack being filled with facts, we entertain the possibility that knowledge can be in her mind without being understood. Contrast this with learning that has been assimilated by an individual and to which an individual's existing knowledge has accommodated. This is learning that has become linked in many ways to the learner's existing stock of knowledge. Admittedly, in the attempts to reveal the flaws in a metaphor, we are employing other metaphors. The idea of a link is no exception. But the use of a metaphor per se cannot be open to objection. Talk about the mind and psychological processes is saturated with metaphor. If we try to avoid it, we just end up using other metaphors. Typical phrases include sharp intelligence, deep sadness, cold personality, and drained of all emotion. Such language is not the monopoly of the layman. Psychology has plenty. For example, fluid ability, fuzzy concept, cognitive map, problem space, and many others. So, there is nothing wrong with metaphor, but influential metaphors associated with learning need close scrutiny. According to the construction metaphor, learners are portrayed as agents who construct or build up their own learning. Teachers join in with this metaphor, so to speak, by providing scaffolding for their students to build up their knowledge. Some philosophers feel that the image of construction has been more successful in what it sought to oppose than in terms of the light it has shed on the process of learning. Dennis Phillips holds that constructivism has, quote, become akin to a secular religion with many sects, end of quote. I want to talk a little about what constructivists want to oppose, namely certain versions of transmission. We might think that the transmission analogy seems to leave room for the possibility that knowledge could be put into a learner regardless of the learner's cognitive state at the time. Now, arguably this could happen, at least if we're not too fussy about what we count as learning and as knowledge. There is a traditional account of what it is to know something that goes back to Plato. If I know that the Battle of Hastings took place in 1066, it must be true that the battle occurred on the said date. I must believe that it took place at this time, and I must be justified in believing this. On this basis, can my teacher transmit such a fact to me? My justification for believing her could be the following. She has told me things on many previous occasions, and I have found her to be reliable. Hence it could be reasonable for me to take it from her on this occasion. That's so even if we put on one side the question of how I found out that she was reliable. But we do need to think more carefully about all this. On the transmission model just outlined, the teacher might tell me that the mome wraths outgrabe. In the past, I may have found her to be a trusted authority, so I might be inclined to accept that she has told me something true, on the assumption, of course, that I am ignorant of children's literature classics. However, I would have absolutely no idea what she was attempting to convey. Hence, I could scarcely be described as having acquired knowledge. This, of course, is an extreme case, since the sentence concerned means nothing. So, in principle, it cannot be understood. So, consider instead a teacher informing a 9-year-old student of Einstein's claim that gravity is the curvature of time-space. A clever child might have some vague ideas about this, but again, she could hardly be said to have come to know something as a result of the teacher's transmission. Her problem is that her current knowledge is not of an appropriate kind to accommodate the Einstein material. She can make few, if any, links between this Einsteinian physics content and her existing knowledge and understanding. It is true that in principle the material could be understood. However, the child's epistemic state with respect to this is similar to that achieved when confronting the excerpt from Lewis Carroll's Jabberwocky. The child would not know anything as a result of the teacher's transmission. If we react against this extreme version of transmission, we may want to continue to pursue the constructivism metaphor. But to repeat, we've only looked briefly at extreme versions of transmission. Anyway, to return to our consideration of constructivism. A troublesome theme in the history of constructivism is the thought that if we invent or construct knowledge, then that is exactly what we end up with, merely our invention. Constructivism has occasionally been pitted against the thought that learning involves discovering aspects of an independent reality. A famous or infamous radical constructivist, Ernst von Glasersfeld, is often quoted as claiming that the results of our cognitive efforts have the purpose of helping us cope in the world of experience, rather than the traditional goal of furnishing an objective representation of a world that might exist apart from us and our experience. Radical constructivism has sometimes set itself up as the sane alternative to a naive correspondence theory of truth and a crude empiricist foundationalist account of knowledge. Broadly and crudely speaking, an empiricist foundationalist account of knowledge says this: our sense experience directly informs us of the nature of an independent reality. Our claims about this reality, if true, are true insofar as they mirror the features of this reality. As sketched here, few if any thinkers have been fully committed to the radical constructivism of von Glasersfeld. It arguably involves a very familiar self-refuting relativism. Von Glasersfeld and his followers presumably want us to take his claims about the status of our constructed knowledge very seriously. Yet, on his own account, these claims are merely constructed. They fail to achieve an objective representation of how things are with our knowledge. Understood in this spirit, he would seem to have undermined his own credentials. Another point now about our construction metaphor. Pushing the construction metaphor further than it can go produces an infinite regress. The student constructs her knowledge from what? The answer has to be knowledge she already possesses. Was that knowledge itself constructed? Either it was, so we continue the regress, or it was not, in which case we are confronted with the possibility of knowledge which is not constructed. If this is possible, does this undermine the power of the construction metaphor? If a student can know something which she has not constructed, could it not be argued that this lets the possibility of transmission back in? At what point is construction deemed essential for learning? Why? These kinds of regresses have long been explored by philosophers of education. They may well go back to Plato's Meno. David Hamlin investigates the thought that, quote, the acquisition of knowledge implies already existing knowledge. Where does that ultimately come from? End of quote. Atkinson discusses a similar regress, though not explicitly in connection with the construction metaphor. Both Hamlin and Atkinson are well aware of the errors inherent in thinking of the acquisition of knowledge as an all or nothing event, like coming to possess a piece of property. They talk of the slow process of coming to master interconnected concepts. Both writers deny that appealing to innate ideas could halt this regress. Innate ideas could not amount to knowledge in their view, for knowledge, they tell us, requires the existence of interpersonal standards and social communication. Hamlin and Atkinson argue that the way out of the regress is to appreciate that the earliest elements from which knowledge is constructed are not themselves instances of knowledge. They are rather reactions which learners have in common with all of us. Atkinson appeals to Wittgenstein's ideas about patterns of agreement in how we perceive and react to the world. This is a matter of sharing forms of life, or inhabiting a common background, to employ John Searle's phrase. Now a little bit about active learning. Part of the motivation for the construction metaphor in the first place was the vision of active learners. This was seen as part of the appeal of seeing people as constructing knowledge as opposed to being a passive student absorbing knowledge from the teacher. The notion of activity and the active learner have been central to child-centred education, at least since the time of Dewey. However, it has a troubled history in the long-standing campaign to oppose transmission and the idea of the passive learner. Michael Bonnet denies the link between self-expression in the classroom and a room full of noise and blustering busyness. Whether individuals can best build or construct during their learning while physically active is an empirical question. It cannot be settled merely by appealing to the metaphor. Even the idea of physical activity is unclear. Must activity involve the whole body? Or will just part of it do? Can the activities vary, or could the same physical movements be repeated? Without empirical evidence to the contrary, why deny the possibility that students sat still listening to a teacher or lecturer can be engaged in constructing learning? So, it might be mental activity that is the key. But again, we cannot arrive at a verdict without being clearer about the nature of the proposal. Suppose I decide to summon up the same mental image repeatedly for some reason. I might be said to be mentally active, at least after a fashion. Intuitively, however, this is not the kind of mental activity valued by the constructivist. Is the use of imagination required? I'm afraid that the constructivist who assented to this would not be out of the woods. This is because imagining seems to cover a number of importantly different mental activities. Repeatedly summoning up the same mental images might count as using the imagination, but perhaps the constructivist wants something more creative or inventive. Supporters of the idea of active learning might protest that we are being too severe and argue that at least it rules out passivity, even if it is not immediately clear what it rules in. Now for some final remarks. Some contributors to debates about constructivism claim that people often confuse constructivism as a philosophical epistemological position about knowledge with constructivism as a pedagogy. Expressions associated, rightly or wrongly, with constructivist pedagogy include learning by discovery, teachers acting as educational impresarios rather than authoritative figures who find effective ways of imparting knowledge to their students, and so on. However, constructivist pedagogy might be advocated by educators who wouldn't go anywhere near the radical constructivism of von Glasersfeld and his ilk. Moreover, a radical constructivist might believe in traditional pedagogy, where, crudely speaking, teachers deliver content from the front. Constructivist pedagogy does not entail constructivist epistemology, and constructivist epistemology does not entail constructivist pedagogy. Thank you.